Hi, I want to talk to you in this video about a very different scheme of categories. Well, very different I say, very different in its origin. It comes from a school of Indian philosophy known as Vaisesika. Vaisesika is a translation for our term particularism, and it means a philosophical view that is dedicated to the idea that what fundamentally exists in the world are particular objects. It has a lot of similarities to Aristotle's system of categories, both in its general methodological approach, but also in some of the specific categories, as we'll see. But it does add quite a few different ones as well, leaving out some that Aristotle supplies, adding in new ones that Aristotle lacks. And so I want to think about this different categorical scheme. I think that if we look at it, we'll see something deeper about the nature of a very system of categories. It's not necessarily tied to the specific categories and the specific way of dividing up being, dividing up language, dividing up thought or reality that Aristotle uses. We can adopt the same approach and end up in a somewhat different place. Classical Indian metaphysics is divided into several schools. In fact, classically there are 6 darshanas, or schools of Hinduism. Several of these, Nyaya and Vaisesika, primary among them, are pretty much, well, realist schools. That is to say, who believe that the world is really out there, really independent of the mind. There are many schools, including really the main one, Advaita Vedanta, that is idealistic in approach. And we're going to talk about that contrast very much during a later part of the course. But for now, I want to just locate Vaisesika as one of the realist schools. It is something dedicated to particularism, saying the world consists of particular objects, people, books, tables, chairs, plants, animals, and so forth. And those particular objects are the fundamental units. They really are out there. They're not in any sense constructions of the mind. They aren't in any other way dependent on the mind. They aren't merely concepts. They are really things outside of us. Well, that contrast between realism and idealism is pretty fundamental throughout the entire history of philosophy, and in particular of Indian philosophy. Buddhism, as well as Advaita Vedanta, are primarily idealist. And in this respect, actually, Indian philosophy is somewhat different from Western philosophy. They both contain this same contrast between realist and idealistic approaches. But idealism is really the dominant one throughout the history of Indian philosophy. On the other hand, throughout Western philosophy, I would have to say that until at least the last couple of centuries, realism has been the dominant school. So the idealist says everything is mind-dependent. Everything is, in a sense, a construction of or a projection of the mind. And so objects aren't, in a certain sense, really out there independently of us. They are, in some sense, constituted by our own mental activity. The realist, in contrast, thinks that no, the world really is out there. It is not in any sense the product of my mental activity. It's something that has its own independent existence. And so Hindu philosophers of the logic, Nyaya, and the particularist, Vaisesika schools, they are realists. They maintain that the world really does have that kind of independent existence. Rocks, stones, trees, they're all outside my head. They're in the world in a mind-independent fashion. They would be there even if my mind didn't exist, even if there were no human minds or minds of any other kind to appreciate them. Now, let's talk in particular about Vaisesika, or particularism. The figure we're going to look at, who is said to be the author of the Vaisesika Sutra, is Kanada. He lived around the year 100, and he says, I will enumerate everything that has the character of being. He puts together a system of categories that is meant to do that is meant to outline the basic categories of being, and to answer the most fundamental question of metaphysics, of ontology: what is there? Well, the answer is going to be, as the name of the school indicates, particular things. And the method he uses is one that relies on everyday speech and behavior. So everyday speech, everyday behavior, that's the touchstone. What do I act in the ordinary sense every day as if it exists? Well, things like books, tables, chairs, vegetables, animals, minerals. I act as if those things are the real constituents of the world. And I speak that way too. So he goes about identifying categories, padartha, the types of things to which words refer, he says. And notice that idea. These are the kinds of things that words refer to. So he's going to look to language to understand the structure of thinking and the structure of the world. I want to understand the basic structure of the world. I look at the structure of language. I say, well, what is there in the world? What are the units in the world? I said, what are the basic units of language? After all, I use language to talk about the world. So I point at an object like the book. I say, aha, here is a book. I make some reference to it. I use language, this book, or just book, to describe this. And so in general, you might say, I am using language to discuss the world. I am acting toward objects in the world. See what I say. See how I act to determine what the real constituents of the world are. When we do that, the Vaisesika Sutra says there are three basic categories of things that emerge. There are, and now this won't surprise you after looking at Aristotle, substances, things like pot, cloth, fire, or soul. Soul might be a little surprising. The others are very direct and material. But in any case, these are the examples that are given in the sutra of substances. They are the basic particular things of the world. And so remember, Aristotle distinguished between primary substances, the this is this such, and then the suches, the secondary substances or the general kinds. The primary examples given throughout the Vaisesika tradition are all of these primary substances: the pot, the cloth, fire, or the soul. The one that sounds a little bit kind-like is fire, since it's a mass term. Fire, water, gold, those are mass terms instead of terms for particular individual objects. And so those come close to this idea of a kind. Secondly, there are qualities. For example, square or blue. A quality is something that is, again, familiar from Aristotle's categories. It is something that is a predicate said of a substance. The pot is blue, for example, or the cloth is square. These are things that we can use to describe and discuss substances. And then there are motions or actions, like move, eat, or throw. A substance can move another substance, or eat it, or throw it, and so forth. And so all of those correspond to items in Aristotle's categories. And grammatically, they correspond to very simple categories: substance, pot, cloth, fire, soul. They're nouns or noun phrases. And then qualities, square or blue, they are adjectives. Then motions like move, eat, or throw, they are verbs. And so we've got the basic categories of language here: nouns, adjectives, verbs. Those things are existent. In the Sanskrit, it's simply sat. They are existent. They are the kinds of being. They are the three fundamental kinds of things that exist. So there are actions. And I can talk about actions. I can predicate things of actions. I can say, wow, you threw that hard. Or he moved very quickly. Or I ate it slowly. I can say things about even square or blue. I might say blue is my favorite color. Or square is a shape that is much simpler than a dodecahedron. I can say various things, of course, about substances as well. So I could predicate things of any of these kinds. You might say they are all subjects of predication. Nevertheless, qualities are typically predicated of substances. Motions, things that are done by substances and to substances. So here's a simple example. We have a running dog, and what's the substance? Well, what is that? It's a dog. So primarily, we say, all right, basic substance is the dog. Quality, well, there are many things I could use to describe the dog. Here's an obvious one: it's brown. And then what is it doing? Well, it's running. So we've got a dog, it's a brown dog, and it's running. That categorizes it in terms of substance, in terms of quality, and in terms of action. Or similarly here, we've got two people. We've got a child who is wet and smiling. The child is the substance, has the quality of being wet in the rain, and is enjoying it, right? Is smiling. And then there's a woman. She is holding a leaf. That's an action, but she is also smiling. And she too is wet in the rainstorm. And so it's easy to describe that scene by saying, aha, two primary substances here. But of course, there are others. There are two wicker pots. We've got the leaf. We've got plants around. We've got the water. So as we give more and more description of that little scene, we supply more and more substances, we attribute qualities to them and actions to them. And so the basic terms we use for describing a scene like this are already outlined by the Vaisesika Sutra as being of these categories. These do correspond, in some cases very directly, in other cases not quite so directly, to Aristotle's categories. Aristotle too had a category of substance. He had a quality of motion and included both the active and the passive part, so the thanking and the being thanked, the throwing and the being thrown, and so forth. But still, you might say, the Vaisesika category is meant to include both of those. Any action is one that involves something doing something, and it may be doing it to something else. And so that's something that has, as it were, both of those aspects to it. They're both covered under the same thing in the Vaisesika Sutra. But then we can talk about many different qualities. Of course, there's an Aristotelian category of quality. So we might think, aha, good, we've got that matchup, but then where are the relations, the places, the times, positions, the states, and so on? Well, it's not as if Kanada is just ignoring all of that. Actually, those are all considered relations, or all considered qualities in this tradition. So relations are really a kind of quality. So are quantities. If I say I'm 6 feet tall, that's attributing something to me. That's a phrase that is basically adjectival. It's attributing a certain quality of being 6 feet tall to me. And the same thing if I say I'm in Austin. It's attributing something to me. It's describing the quality of being in Austin. And so you might say what Aristotle has done here from the point of view of the Vaisesika Sutra is subdivide quality into a bunch of different kinds of qualities, some of them very simple qualities like blue or square, others more complex qualities like relational ones or ones that relate to places and times, positions and states. Now, as the Vaisesika tradition continues, philosophers add additional categories. In fact, around the year 1000, the Nyaya logic school combines with the Vaisesika or Particularism school to form something known as Nyaya Vaisesika, or logic particularism, often referred to as Navna Nyaya, in other words, the new logic. Those thinkers, as the tradition develops, add other categories. So in addition to the basic three, substance, quality, and motion, we get these categories. And I find them extremely interesting because they are not present in Aristotle's list of categories. They are also interesting from a metaphysical point of view. Are they things that really ought to be recognized as metaphysically fundamental? Or are they things that shouldn't be? These are highly controversial categories in Western philosophy and in Indian philosophy too. So let's take a look at what they are. The first one is universality. Good example, triangularity, or humanity, circularity, or being colored, something like that. A universal is something that we've looked at in Western philosophy in the context of Plato's forms. It is a universal, something that has multiple instances. Now you can see that recognizing those is a significant departure for the Vaisesika thinkers because after all the name of the school is particularism. The idea is that what is there in the world? Well, particular things, particular qualities of those things those things do or have done to them. And now we add, oh, but they're also universals. These multiply instantiated things like colors and properties and relations. Ooh, well, that's a rather different thing. Those aren't particular. And so they have multiple instances. This is a significant change to the theory. The second is inherence. So the pots being blue, the things having that quality or instantiating that universal. What Plato would have referred to as the relation of participation. But here, in a particular form, that is to say, this participating in that universal. So the pots being blue, this shape being square, me exhibiting humanity. Those are examples of inherence. Then there are individualizers. That's a third category, and again, a highly controversial one. It differentiates the atoms. The worry is, what if we have a bunch of this suches, where the such is all the same? They're all basically identical. We get a bunch of paper cups coming out of the factory, and they're in big stacks, stack after stack, and we realize every cup is just the same as every other cup. Well, They're all of the same kind. Now that's not so surprising. There are many people, different people of the same kind, except these aren't differentiated by any other qualities. And it might be that they don't do anything different. They are in a package and they're just stacked there in the package like every other one. And you might look at that and think, well, gosh, I don't know what to say here. I've got many of these cups that have been produced by the factory, thousands, maybe even millions, but I can't differentiate them in terms of the kind of thing they are. They're all paper cups. I can't differentiate them in terms of any qualities because they look like their qualities are all exactly the same. I can't differentiate them in terms of what they're doing because they're all doing the same thing. And so how do I differentiate them? Why aren't they all just the same cup? And so the thought here is there must be something that differentiates them, something that makes this paper cup and that paper cup. Well, what could that be? If it's not a substance and not a quality and it's not an action, what is it? An individualizer. And then finally, there's an absence, like the elephant in this room. Yeah, there isn't an elephant in this room. And so what makes that true, that there's not an elephant in this room? Well, the absence of an elephant. Anyway, that's an odd one. The first three are said in the tradition to be present. Bhava is the term, the last absent, abhava. But they can all be talked about. They can all be named. I can talk about the lack of an elephant. Ordinarily, I don't regret the lack of an elephant in the room, but I might regret the lack of something else. For example, I'm speaking in a room that's empty. Except for me, there are no students here. I feel the absence of the students. And so you might say, look, I can talk about it. Yeah, it's a little tough to teach with nobody there, to teach sort of a camera. And I feel very much the absence of a student. So you would say, oh, that's kind of strange, right? What do you mean? These absences, they're not parts of the world. But you can miss someone. You can feel that person's absence. Or you can mourn someone if they die. You can have a very strong, powerful sense of their absence. And so there are things like that that indicate, yeah, admittedly, an absence isn't really present in the world. That would be a bizarre thing to say. But nevertheless, we can talk about absences in that way, and not just in the sense of regretting them. I might say, well, look, to do this project, we're going to need some wood. So go out and buy some wood. What I'm saying right now, we lack the wood we need for the project. Go buy the wood so we won't lack it anymore. And I'm thinking about our lack of wood or our lack of tools, and I say we have to go get those. So absences can be talked about and named too. Well, let's say a little bit more about universality. A universal is something that has multiple instances. Triangularity, a good example. Look at that photograph. There are many wooden triangles there depicted in that photograph. Triangularity is exhibited all the way through there, not just by one big triangle, but by many different triangles. That triangle, this triangle, that's a particular one, but triangularity is found all over the place. And if we think, hey, look, I talk about triangularity as well as this particular triangle or that one, or I can talk about humanity, for example, or I can talk about color as opposed to this particular color or that color, then it looks like I'm talking about universals. Inherence, well, I can talk about that person being angry. And for example, I might say, well, I think John's anger was unjustified. And I'm saying that person being angry is itself unjustified. I'm predicating something of that person's being angry. And so I'm talking about a thing having a certain property, having a certain quality. In other words, I'm talking about a relation of inherence. Individualizers, the classical example from analytic philosophy, contemporary Anglo-American philosophy, is Max Black's two iron spheres. He imagines a universe that contains absolutely nothing except these two iron spheres. And they are identical in every respect. They share exactly the same properties. They are qualitatively identical. As philosophers tend to put it, that is to say, they share exactly the same qualities. But still, there are two of them. There are two of these iron spheres, absolutely indiscernible, absolutely, well, just like each other. What distinguishes them? We want to be able to say there are two. In fact, we could do it with one sphere and just talk about one half of that sphere as opposed to the other half. We don't even need two. All we need are two halves of the sphere to get the problem going. We want to say those are two different halves of the sphere or two different spheres. But what makes them different? We've stipulated that they are exactly alike. And that's not just a weird, abstract philosophical problem that nobody but Max Black or someone in the Vaisesika tradition would have thought of. It's a very real sort of situation. Look, you might say that this table consists of many different atoms, lots of electrons, protons, neutrons. And yet, what are these electrons like? You might say, well, yeah, look at any really good electrons in there? So, well, all electrons are alike. An electron is an electron. That's it. Same thing with neutrons. A neutron is a neutron is a neutron. There aren't better and worse ones or heavier and lighter ones and so on. They're just all the same. But wait, if they're all the same, what makes them different? We want to say there are many electrons, many protons, many neutrons. But if they're all qualitatively identical to one another, what distinguishes them? What makes them different? How do I know there are many and not just one? It's not a trivial philosophical problem. Then absences, as depicted on this slide, where there's nothing there. Okay, well, that's a little bit of a joke. It's obvious what would make "there's an elephant in the room" true. But yeah, that. But what would make "there's no elephant in the room" true? Now, if I say I am speaking, it's pretty obvious to point out what in the world is making that true. You just point at me in the act of speaking. But what makes it true that there's no elephant in the room? Well, I can look around the room, but I can't point to anything in particular that tells me there is no elephant in the room. I can't point and say, that's what makes it true there's no elephant in the room. The Vaisesika tradition answers, once it develops to this point, it's the absence of an elephant. This room lacks an elephant, and that's that lack I'm noticing. Well, now we talk about elephants in the room as some obvious thing that's being overlooked. There really is an elephant in the room, and people are pretending it's not there or not talking about it. The origin of that is actually Bishop Berkeley, who challenged scientists to a debate on whether there was an invisible elephant in the room. But in the Indian tradition, elephant in the room tends to mean something different. The assumption is there is no elephant in the room, but what makes it true that there's no elephant in the room? We don't have wood in order to build our project, but what makes it true that there is not wood here? I might say, I don't have a key for that file cabinet. Well, what makes that true? It's the absence of a key. And this is something that you might say leads to both a humorous but also a more serious question about the nature of reality. Can I describe the world just using that original Vaisesika Sutra language of substances, of qualities, of actions? Or do I need these additional things? Do I need to be able to talk about triangularity, for example, or color? Do I need to be able to talk about the pots being blue? Do I need to talk about individualizers? What makes this paper cup different from that one, or this electron different from that one? And finally, absences. Do I really need to talk about absences, lacks, or in a spatial version of this, holes? Are there holes? David and Stephanie Lewis actually wrote a very entertaining paper on the question of whether holes exist. Are there holes? And at first glance, you want to say, well, that's ridiculous. Of course there are no holes in the universe. These absences, the whole point is that there isn't something, so absences don't exist. There aren't lacks, there aren't holes. But then you can think, well, are you saying there are no holes in those donuts? Of course there are holes in those donuts. That's what makes them donuts, and not another kind of pastry. Or here, there's a missing piece of the puzzle. And so, of course there's an absence there. I finished the puzzle, 1,000-piece puzzle. I worked for weeks, and finally I realized, there's a missing piece. No, now I can't finish it. And I talk about the missing piece. Oh, I wish I could find the missing piece. Well, I'm talking about an absence, a lack, a place where there ought to be a piece of the puzzle where there isn't. And so by the end, the Vaisesika tradition says, I do need substances, and I need qualities, and I need actions to describe the world. But, maybe I also need universals, and I need things participating in universals. I need these relations of inherence. I need individualizers. And I need to recognize holes, absences, lacks. They aren't really present in the world, but on the other hand, they're a pretty important part of the world and my experience of it.